Hi there and welcome to another screencast from Simply PE, this time looking at how to revise for GCSE PE exams. And within this presentation we're going to be looking at firstly understanding what assessment skills are needed for the GCSE course. We're then going to have a quick overview understanding how memory, how our brain actually works and how that involves and revolves around revision. We're then going to look at some top tips of how to revise best for PE. So we're going to look at past student examples in regards to how they revise best for the GCSE PE exam. And then ultimately, by the end of this presentation, finding out what works for you, because ultimately you're watching this and hopefully going to come up with some tips and ideas as to how to revise best and ultimately be successful in PE. So let's get cracking with today's content. So let's first of all look at the GCSE PE assessment skills, and specifically we're looking at the course for AQA PE. Ultimately, when we look at this course, remember we have two theory papers. Paper 1, the anatomy and physiology section, and paper 2, which looks at the socio-cultural influences. And ultimately, you can see there actually in the bottom left diagram that it says paper 3, but don't be alarmed, don't be concerned. That is focusing on your practical performance, your NEA, and it's also looking at the written coursework. So for this content, we're really looking at how to revise best for the two written examination papers. So for paper 1 and paper 2. And ultimately, when we think of both of those written papers, we're looking at the assessment skills of AO1, AO2, and AO3. So by AO1, we're talking about basic demonstration of knowledge and understanding. Okay, so command words, as it says there, like define, state, give, and identify, among others. When we look at AO2, for example, here we're providing examples. So we're applying our knowledge to various factors that underpin the performance. And ultimately here we need to be able to describe, we need to be able to explain, we need to be able to apply and provide examples to different topics. And then finally, when we focus on AO3, this is focusing on the analysis, so the evaluation, being able to give your opinion on two sides of an argument, for example, but also being able to interpret which training method might be best in terms of nutrition, what component of nutrition might be best for recovery, for example. Okay, so here, the AO3 is the most in-depth answers that you're going to be able to give. So that's those 6-mark, those 9-mark questions that you'll find towards the end of the paper. You can also see a breakdown within the diagram here in the bottom left, a breakdown in terms of percentages, the approximate weighing per AO1, AO2 and AO3 for each paper. And ultimately, on my next slide, you'll be able to see roughly how many percentage marks equate to AO1, AO2 and AO3. So when we focus on the exam breakdown itself, ultimately these are approximations. So every year it slightly differs from mark to mark, okay, from paper to paper. But ultimately we're looking between 40 to 45% of paper 1 being AO1, okay, so you applying or understanding and demonstrating that knowledge. So do you know the difference between your tibia and fibula? Do you understand what we mean by circuit training and maybe some of the descriptions and features of that type of training? That would be demonstrating your understanding. AO2 is somewhere in the region between 30 to 35% of your overall marks for both paper 1 and in paper 2. And that's you giving examples. That's you applying your knowledge. Okay, so being able to explain, for example, what type of exercise would be an isotonic muscle contraction? What type of exercise would be isometric? Okay. And then finally, for that 20 to 25% of the marks, we're looking at the AO3, the evaluation, and that's the 9-mark question That's the 6-mark question, that extended questioning and answering that you will be finding at the end of each of your examination papers. So before we do anything else, let's start to understand and recognize how our brain works in regards to memory recall, and especially when we're looking at that process of revision and recapping information. So ultimately, information comes into us. Even as you watch this presentation, for example, information is being provided to you, and that green text box, for example, coming onto the screen is information that you've now just witnessed. Listening to me, for example, is information that you've now taken hopefully in. And ultimately, from that information, we register it through our senses. So through auditory, through visual, for example, sometimes through touch, sometimes through smell. Okay, and ultimately, we then filter that information, and some of that will then go towards our short-term memory, and we actually call that selective attention. So what are you paying attention to now? It's the diagram. Is it listening to me? Is it neither? Are you kind of looking around the room? Are you kind of looking at your phone, looking at the TV? Okay, so that selective attention is important in order for it to go to the short-term memory. Now, hopefully you'll recognise and know from one of the topics like the information processing model in PE that ultimately in regards to our short-term memory, that lasts for around about 30 seconds. And ultimately, that information that we take in that goes to the short-term memory, a lot of it will get lost, okay, through what we call decay. But ultimately, we need to refresh our memory, refresh our minds, and we need to ensure that we have that kind of reinforcement over time and repetitively through attention, through repetition, in order for it to go to our medium-term memory. And ultimately, from our medium-term memory, which lasts for somewhere in the region of about a week, a couple of weeks maximum, ultimately, again, some of that information will be lost, again, through decay, if we don't try and retrieve it, or if we don't recap on it, and so on. But if we do continue to recap on it, if we do continue to what we call encode, so we start to make some of those, maybe let's say muscle movement patterns, or we start to make some of those links between a certain topic and a certain answer or a certain outcome, and if we encode that, then hopefully that becomes then ingrained into our long-term memory. So if we think of a young child, for example, learning to walk, okay, first of all, that short-term memory, okay, it then becomes repetitive after the baby's then crawled now onto the feet and they've repeated that process time and time and time again, that they're then walking. Ultimately, it's fully functional. It becomes automatic. It's ingrained long term. So we don't actually think about how to walk in regards to our long-term memory because it's encoded within us. Those kind of neuro pathways within our brain are working there to ensure that we are fully developed and we know how to do that. And ultimately, in terms of our long-term memory, that is indefinite. It's fully expanding, okay? And ultimately, that carries on throughout our lifetime. And ultimately, with that long-term memory, that's what's going to help us be able to recall that information. And ultimately, when you're taking your GCSEs, when you're taking your specific and different subjects, ultimately, you need to be able to embed some of that knowledge, a lot of that knowledge from a lot of your subjects to be able to recall, retrieve it when you require it for your specific exams. So what's the point of revision? Why do we recap? Ultimately, as you can see from this diagram here, your short-term memory will take in around about 6, 7 different bits of information at a time in sort of 20, 30-second bursts. And ultimately, that primary effect, as you can see there in that diagram, is what you hear and listen to first. Okay, so if you remember that previous diagram, you will probably be able to remember the color of that text box, which was information, because that was the first thing that was given to you. Can you remember what color it was? Pause your video here, give you 3-4 seconds to see if you can remember it. Hopefully you did remember it, and ultimately it was green. Okay, so well done if you got that right. But ultimately what happens with our short-term memory is it starts to suffer after that primary effect and we get a dip. Okay, so we forget things kind of in the middle. And then ultimately we've got that Renaissance section towards the end, and ultimately there within that Renaissance section is we remember the last thing we've heard. So have a think about maybe when you've talked to a sibling or a parent and ultimately said, "You're not listening, are you?" And then you repeat that last sentence as to what they said. That's that Renaissance effect ultimately, that you've remembered the last thing I said, but maybe you couldn't remember what was said during the middle or perhaps most of what was said at the start. So what about this question here? What color was the medium memory text box from the previous slide? Pause your video here, see if you can remember. All right, did you get the right color? Did you get the right answer? I'm pretty sure it was purple. So ultimately, if you got that right, well done. Okay, so let's look at chunking information, and there's a list of, or there's some letters there. What I want you to do is to write those. I want you to look at the screen first of all. Actually, I want to give you sort of 10 seconds to see if you can memorize it. And ultimately, within those 10 seconds, so a few seconds left, I now would like you to write down what letters you can remember. Okay, so have a go. I'll give you another 10 seconds writing down what letters you think you can remember from there. Okay, so there was 13 letters on the screen. How many do you think you got? Ultimately, there are 13 individual letters, or if you decided to chunk the letters, okay, you could have done it in 4 different chunks. Okay, so there's 2 ways of kind of looking at this information here. 13 individual letters, or a more kind of easier, approachable method is through chunking information. And when we revise, that's kind of what we need to do. We need to chunk that information into small clumps, small bits that are going to be more manageable. So here, for example, you can see USA, MSN, GCSE, and NBC. Those would have been your 4 chunks. Okay, so from there, what I really want you to kind of just understand and get is that you're not revising each topic individually, but you're starting to chunk some of that information together, which will help you and help that information become a bit more manageable for you as a student. Okay, so let's start relating some of this to PE, and specifically when we're looking at improving our memory using mnemonics and acronyms to help us. And the mnemonics are kind of like rhymes or silly sentences that we might kind of stick into our memory that helps us chunk some of that information. Okay, and it helps us kind of aid and to remember things like spellings, but also kind of little grouped words within topics. Okay, so here's one for you. A marvelous boy called Rick can't pick strawberries forever. Mic drop. If you think of the first letter of that sentence, okay, A for agility, M for muscular endurance, B for balance, C for coordination, R for reaction time, C for cardiovascular endurance, P for power, S for speed, F for flexibility, M for muscular strength. Okay, so there we're looking at chunking some of that information as components of fitness. Okay, so we can start to build that in through silly sentences, acronyms, however best that kind of works for you. We can also see it through topics like influences in sport or principles of training, where we're using the acronym of CHIRPS, or we're looking at principles of training, we've got sport or the principle of fit, okay, and knowing and understanding what each of those letters stand for. So try it with some of the topics as you go through some of your revision. Now, before you get started with any of your revision, it's really important, whether it be in PE or any other subject, that you create a checklist. And what I mean by that is a tick list or a checklist with a timetable on it, with the specific subjects or even subtopics, so that you ensure that you can tick off or you can cross off your list what you've done and when you've done it. And the reason for a tick list or a checklist that's so important is ultimately it provides you with that motivation. It provides you with that sense of achievement or satisfaction to tick off or say, yeah, I've completed that, I've done that. You can also analyze your process, your progress, should I say, not your process, your progress. And ultimately that will help you feel like you've achieved whatever it's that you've looked to try to achieve during the course of that day or during the course of that revision session. And ultimately, it should also help you try and establish what topics are on what paper. So for paper one, the anatomy and physiology topics, paper two, understanding what's going to come up on that paper two for the socio-culture. Ultimately, you also want to be able to direct your time effectively and ensure that time management and distractions are at a minimum. And I've called that active learning because ultimately there's no point you just making shed loads of notes and repeating yourself time and time again. By actively learning, by triggering the learning process within your brain and being able to think about responses and answers to questions, that's what's going to help to encode and embed to your long-term memory. And ultimately, you need to be able to kind of chunk that within 15 to 20 minutes per revision slot or session. Make sure you also have regular breaks. That's really important when it comes to revision, and try to keep that in proportion to your revision. So if you're revising for 20 minutes, make sure your break is no longer than 20 minutes. Okay. Keep distractions away. So if you've got a phone near you, make sure you get rid of it. Okay, put it in a different room. If you've got an iPad, TV on, try and make sure you remove that. Music, on the other hand, can work in two ways. Some people enjoy listening to music that has, let's say, minimal lyrics, for example, but just background music. So some things like that can sometimes be quite beneficial and helpful as well. But ultimately, again, try to do things that work best for you. It's really important before you kind of revise that you get yourself prepared. So have those tools, those materials to hand, whether it be a revision guide, whether it be pens, highlighters, post-it notes, folders. There's an endless list there of things that you could include. So again, try and make sure you've got some of those materials that are going to work best for you. Okay, because if you're starting to scratch around and you're kind of looking for material within those 15-20 minute slots, that's not really revision. That's you kind of trying to prepare yourself for revision. So that preparation phase is absolutely key. So let's now look at the revision methods, the top tips that might be able to help you for the GCSE exam. So one of the first ones to look at is mind maps or spider diagrams, and ultimately making sure that you pose either the topic in the middle of that spider diagram or a key question. And then from there, you branch out maybe subheadings and subtopics that are going to be able to help, and then be able to piece out further information so it starts to spread and look within the diagram where you can include symbols, pictures, and so on. Again, this can sometimes help your memory encode, your memory recall by thinking about some of those pictures, some of those keywords, some of those key headings. Sometimes using different size paper can also help in regards to this type of method. Another key method and a really popular technique is this idea of a revision card or a flashcard. So using an A5 or A6 piece of card where you might write some of the key content on one side, exam questions perhaps, answers on the flip side as well. Okay, and using those cards can really help in terms of storing information, just to kind of starting to minimize some of your workload from your exercise book or from your revision guide or from these presentations, for example, where you can start to answer those questions yourself as you read them. Okay, also trying to stick them sometimes around the room can help as well, because it can make you kind of just look at them every now and again and see if you can, flip over the card to see the answer again on the other side. Again, using colors can help with this. So I've seen lots of students, for example, use different color highlighters for paper one, for example, in, let's say, the color blue, and paper two might be in yellow or in red. So they've got the key different revision cards or flashcards with two separate colors for those two exam papers. So things like that can definitely help. Another good technique and good method to use that might help you is using post-it notes. Post-it notes can be in different forms of colours or the same colours, and sometimes those different colours can help represent advantages and disadvantages. So an example here is I've used kind of training methods. So thinking about what the advantages maybe of interval training. What's the disadvantages of interval training? You could do the same for continuous, for circuit, for plyometrics, and so on. You might want to use those post-it notes for definitions. Okay, you might bullet point some key questions that might help you pose some answers that you might branch out of it using some post-it notes. You might use those post-it notes to help you prioritize. So what's the most important to the least important? So that's useful when it comes to things like components of fitness, on a specific example of a sportsman. So is power more important than balance? And trying to place those post-it notes in what you think is the right order to being able to justify your answers. Okay, another example here is using kind of what we call memory anchors or picture-based notes. So you can see there on the diagram, in using a word, if you're artistic, if you're able to kind of draw well, then using a symbol to represent one of those keywords. And that can again help you encode, that can help with your recall, your longer term memory, by having not only a combination of written notes, but also a combination of colours. So you could, for example, have a specific colour scheme for the skill classifications, so the open and closed skills, for example, the gross and fine motor skills. All right. But you don't have to be the best artist to do this. Whatever works and is going to help you remember using those symbols and keywords can help. Okay, using the internet can help you if you can find pictures and images, if you want to use templates in that sense as well. Another good example that a lot of my students have used in the past is using kind of flow diagrams or timelines, for example, even in PE. If we think of a flow diagram or a flow chart where we look at the mechanics of breathing, we look at the airflow in regards to how it moves down from the mouth and throat down to the trachea, and then further on, eventually down into the alveoli. Ultimately, those type of things are going to help. The cardiac system, when we look at the structure of the heart and then how the blood gets pumped around the body and then into the main muscles and then ultimately then back towards the heart and then to the lungs, that process there can sometimes help as well, using some of those flow charts as well. Using different color pens, highlighters, again adding images, can help with that longer term memory. I think this is an important one that sometimes students forget about, and it's trying to do some of your revision as a pair or as a group. And that could be remotely done, that could be through FaceTime, it could be through a video call. And engaging in conversation with someone can help you understand a topic better, because you might be able to talk through that topic with another person. Okay, that other person listening can identify if there's any misconceptions, any mistakes, any faults in terms of things that you're saying. Talking about things like performance enhancing substances within PE, the advantages and disadvantages, for example, the effects within the body, a lack of exercise, the effects that can have on the body. Reducing ways of hooliganism. Some of these socio-cultural topics really lend to paired and group learning. And whether it's in a remote learning phase where you might just want to FaceTime and again, even a regular phone call, some of those things can really help. Otherwise, you can use people at home if you have people at home as well that are willing to listen and engage in conversation at a suitable time. So speaking to a parent, a sibling, to a close family friend or relative, being able to test yourself through them by talking to them. Have they got any questions that they want to ask you about the topic that you might then hopefully be able to describe back to them? Okay, those type of conversations really help with the AO2 and the AO3, because it gets you to be able to explain the topic and also be able to sometimes evaluate the topic as well. Ultimately, as you watch this, there are lots of different interactive software that's out there to help with your learning. And these three there that I've put on are to help really with your active learning. I think that's really important to make a note of. So there's loads of different softwares out there to help you. But the idea of Seneca, of BBC Bitesize, and this kind of YouTube channel, what you'll notice is each of those platforms have some form of testing towards the end of it, or a task for you to complete. And ultimately, that's to get you engaged in your learning, not just copying notes, not just making notes, but actually thinking about what's the right answer to a specific question that's posed. And you'll notice that at the end of each of the chapters in terms of Seneca and BBC Bite Size, that they do that quite well to check for your understanding as well. I think all students and all teachers will really agree with this final examination tip for you, and that's thinking about exam practice and maybe using some of these exam guides that sort of work where they give you a workbook that you can complete as well. Basically, when you kind of write an answer and you practice an exam, it's a bit like practicing for a sporting performance, okay? The training beforehand, that is the exam practice. That's getting you ready for you for the ultimate match day performance, which for you guys will be sitting that assessment, whether it be in class or formal exam. It's important you're honest with yourself. It's important that you kind of self-evaluate, you kind of self-assess that, and you don't try and cheat. You don't try and go and Google the answer. You don't try and go and find the answer on your phone or whatever else. Be honest with yourself, because ultimately, whether it be an in-class assessment or a formal assessment, you would be under exam conditions where you won't be able to look at your phone. You won't be able to look up the answer in a textbook. Time yourself. That's so important. Okay, make sure that the two exams you know are an hour and 15 minutes for paper 1 and for paper 2. Try and practice by timing yourself a minute per mark unless you have extra time that you're qualified for. Ultimately, try and use the mark scheme to construct an answer. Sometimes go back and look at the 6, the 9 marker, even the 4 marker, and look at those mark schemes that are available to you on the AQA website, for example, and actually, can you construct a perfect model answer using that mark scheme? Because again, that will get you practicing, making sure that you put down a perfect, a very good high-level answer. And ultimately, all of this here in terms of exam practice will get to identify your strengths and your weaknesses. And that's so important, isn't it, when we evaluate where we're at, what things do we need to revise a bit more on to get us in coding and our long-term memory and our recall being top drawer for that specific topic. I mean, that's it for me, really. You can see on that final slide here, these are the basics. These are the things that you should be doing, and if not, you should be really making sure that you turn your attention to that now in terms of keeping yourself hydrated, diet, you setting yourself into a decent and a good routine, you plan yourself, you test and so on. But ultimately, as I've said throughout this presentation, do what works best for you, because ultimately what works best for you will drive your motivation, will drive your progress, your performance to hopefully that next level, and hopefully you achieving the best grade possible that you can achieve. Okay, so best of luck with that. All the best in terms of your examination technique and your exams, whether it be this summer or in the future. And ultimately, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you took something away from it.